Under the dim light of a single bulb, Claire signed the lease for the apartment. The landlord, an older man with sunken eyes and a limp, handed her the keys with a faint smile. "Quiet building," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You'll like it here. Just respect the rules." The rules were odd but manageable. No loud music after 9 p.m., no visitors after midnight, and never, under any circumstances, open the door if someone knocked between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Claire brushed it off, thinking it was just another eccentricity of city living. She needed the place, and the rent was suspiciously low for such a spacious unit. The first night passed uneventfully. Claire unpacked her boxes, enjoying the quiet that seemed to blanket the building. The only sound was the faint creak of floorboards above her. She shrugged it off, assuming it was a neighbor moving about. By midnight, she was sound asleep. At exactly 2:27 a.m., a sharp knock echoed through her apartment. Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The sound was deliberate, insistent. She remembered the landlord's rule, never open the door. Swallowing her fear, Claire stayed in bed, clutching the covers. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, until it stopped at precisely 3 a.m. The silence that followed was suffocating, but exhaustion eventually pulled her back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Claire hesitated before opening her door. A small, damp smudge stained the carpet outside her threshold. It was dark red and trailed down the hallway before disappearing. She tried to dismiss it, convincing herself it was rust or spilled wine. Yet, her unease lingered. The following night, the knocking returned. This time it was accompanied by a low, guttural humming. Claire stayed awake, staring at the door, willing the sound to stop. At exactly 3 a.m., the humming ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. She decided to ask her upstairs neighbor about the noises. Knocking on his door, she was greeted by a wiry man with tired eyes. When she explained the nightly disturbances, his expression darkened. "You heard it too?" he whispered. "I've been here 3 months. Same thing every night. But don't break the rules. Ever. Have you told the landlord?" she asked. The man shook his head. "He knows. Everyone in this building knows." Claire's anxiety grew. That night, she set up a camera aimed at her door. She needed to know what or who was knocking. At 2:27 a.m., the knocking began again. Claire stayed in bed, her heart racing. The next morning, she reviewed the footage. Her stomach dropped. The video showed the door rattling slightly with each knock, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. She decided to leave, packing her belongings that afternoon. As she carried boxes to her car, the landlord appeared. "Moving out already?" he asked, his tone calm but with a tinge of disapproval. "Something's wrong with this place," Claire blurted out. "The knocking, the humming, there's something here." The landlord's smile faltered, and for the first time she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You should have told me sooner," he said, "but it's too late now." That night, Claire stayed in a motel, intending to retrieve the last of her things the next day. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, a strange unease washed over her. She checked her phone. It was 2:27 a.m. A knock sounded at her motel door. Her breath caught. She didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the same guttural humming that had haunted her apartment. Trembling, she peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The knocking stopped at 3 a.m., leaving Claire paralyzed with fear. When morning came, she called the police, explaining everything. They accompanied her to the apartment building, but when they arrived, it was abandoned. The landlord, her neighbor, and even her belongings were gone. The place looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years. In the corner of her empty unit was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Unfolding it, she read the scrawled words, "You broke the rules." Beneath the note was a damp, dark red stain. Claire never stayed in one place for long after that, constantly haunted by knocks in the night. Whatever she had disturbed in that building, it wasn't bound to the apartment, and it wasn't going to let her go.
Story number 2.
The first thing Emma noticed about the house was its silence. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet that comes with isolation. It was the oppressive kind that felt alive. Her friend Kara had warned her. "That place has a reputation," she'd said. "People hear things, see things." But Emma had laughed it off. The rent was dirt cheap, and she was desperate for a fresh start after the breakup. The house stood at the edge of town, its windows dark and clouded. The landlord, a pale, nervous man, had handed her the keys with a warning. The basement is off limits. Don't go down there. She had no intention of going into the basement. The upstairs was more than enough space for her. That first night, the silence wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She heard no crickets, no hum of passing cars, just an unbroken stillness. At 2:45 a.m., Emma woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. She froze, her mind racing. The steps were coming from inside the house. Gripping her phone, she crept to her bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. The footsteps continued, pacing the hallway outside her room, each step accompanied by a low, grating creak. She wanted to call someone, but who? The police? What would she say? I think someone's in my house, but I haven't checked. She mustered her courage and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. The floorboards beneath her bare feet were cold and undisturbed. The next morning, she chalked it up to a bad dream. She hadn't been sleeping well lately, after all. But when she ventured into the kitchen, she found the back door unlocked. She was certain she'd locked it before bed. As the days passed, the noises intensified. Cabinets slammed shut on their own. The floorboards creaked in rooms she wasn't in. And always at 2:45 a.m., the footsteps would begin. Slow, measured, pacing her hallway. One night, unable to stand it any longer, she shouted into the empty house, "What do you want?" The pacing stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than any she'd felt before. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then, from the basement, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It started faint, but grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Her landlord's warning echoed in her mind. The basement is off limits. But Emma wasn't thinking clearly anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The air grew colder with every step. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the concrete walls. At the bottom of the stairs was a single wooden door. It was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello?" Her voice trembled, barely audible. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then slowly, the door creaked open wider, revealing the outline of something hunched and misshapen. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking in a way that defied human anatomy. Emma stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The creature, or whatever it was, moved closer. In the dim light, she could see its eyes, black pits that seemed to swallow the darkness around them. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. Her hands shook as she locked it, bracing herself against it. But the thing didn't try to follow her. Instead, she heard it laughing, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. She fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. When she tried to call the landlord, the number was disconnected. She returned with the police the next day, but the house was empty. The basement door was sealed, the lock rusted shut. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone or anything inside. Emma moved far away, but she couldn't escape the nightmares. And sometimes in the stillness of the night, she swore she could hear it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing just outside her door.
Story number 3.
Maggie had been looking forward to her solo retreat in the mountains for weeks. She needed the isolation, the quiet, the chance to write. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was old but cozy, with a stone fireplace and wide wooden beams. The rental agent had called it a writer's paradise. On the second night, the sound started. It was faint at first, a light scraping noise, like a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. Maggie ignored it, telling herself it was just the wind or some small animal. But as the hours dragged on, the sound grew louder. It seemed deliberate now, like something dragging across the outer walls. By 2 a.m., the noise was impossible to ignore. Maggie grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was pitch black, the air biting cold. She scanned the perimeter, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No branches, no animals, no signs of anything that could have made the noise. When she stepped back inside, she froze. There, on the kitchen table, was a single wooden figure, a crude carving of a person, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Maggie's heart raced. She hadn't brought it with her. She hadn't seen it before. She grabbed her phone to call the rental agent, but there was no signal. Typical. She tossed the wooden figure into the fireplace, watching it crackle and burn as the flames consumed it. The next morning, she tried to dismiss the incident as a prank, but when she returned to the cabin after a hike, the figure was back. It sat in the exact same spot on the kitchen table, untouched by fire. This time, a second figure sat beside it, smaller but equally crude. Maggie's skin prickled. She locked every door and window, convinced someone was breaking in. That night, the scraping noise returned, louder and more aggressive. Maggie barricaded herself in the bedroom, her heart pounding as the sound moved around the cabin, circling it like a predator. She clutched a kitchen knife, her only weapon. At 3 a.m., the noise stopped. The silence was worse. When she finally fell asleep, it was only for a few hours. She woke to find her bedroom door ajar. Her stomach churned as she stepped into the main room. The wooden figures were gone, but in their place was something worse. Scratched into the walls in jagged, deep grooves were words, "We see you." The cabin was no longer a refuge. Maggie packed her things in a frenzy, determined to leave. But as she stepped outside, she saw them. The trees were lined with wooden figures, dozens of them, hanging from branches by twisted bits of twine. Each one was more detailed than the last. She swore she recognized her own face in one of them, her terrified expression carved into the wood. Maggie ran to her car, but the engine wouldn't start. The air around her felt heavy, oppressive. She turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and humanoid, but its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, bending in unnatural ways. Its head tilted sharply to the side, just like the wooden carvings. It raised a hand, beckoning her. Maggie ran. She didn't stop, even when the sharp branches of the forest tore at her skin. She didn't stop until she reached the main road, where a passing truck driver found her sobbing and shaking. When the police investigated the cabin, they found no wooden figures, no scratches on the walls, and no sign of anyone or anything that could explain Maggie's story. The rental agency claimed they didn't have her reservation on file, and the cabin itself had supposedly been abandoned for years. But Maggie knows what she saw. She moved to a crowded city, surrounded herself with people, and left the woods far behind. Still, she can't shake the feeling of being watched, and sometimes late at night she hears the faint sound of scraping outside her window.
Story number 4.
The old hotel stood on the outskirts of town, a hulking relic of a bygone era. Its peeling paint and boarded-up windows seemed to dare anyone to enter. For years, it had been a local legend, a place teenagers dared each other to visit, but rarely did. There were whispers about the disappearances, guests who had checked in but never checked out. When Dan, a paranormal investigator, decided to spend the night there for his YouTube channel, he thought he'd hit the jackpot. "This is going to go viral," he told his audience in the intro, the decaying facade of the hotel looming behind him. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a notebook, he stepped inside. The lobby was thick with dust, the air stale and cold. A grand chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and lifeless. The faded wallpaper was torn in places, revealing patches of rotting wood. The front desk sat abandoned, its surface scattered with old, yellowed papers. Dan set up his equipment, running a live stream. The chat buzzed with viewers egging him on. "Explore the basement," one wrote. "Check out room 308, said another. He chuckled nervously, deciding to start with the first floor. The hallways were long and dark, the only light coming from his flashlight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under his feet. As he passed room after room, he noticed something unsettling. Each door had deep scratches near the handle, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way in. At room 101, his EMF detector spiked. The chat exploded with excitement. "You're not alone," someone typed. He hesitated before opening the door. Inside, the room was eerily preserved, as if waiting for a guest. The bed was made, the lampshades intact, and an old rotary phone sat on the nightstand. But the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. The phone rang. Dan froze. His flashlight trembled as he pointed it at the phone. It rang again, the sound shrill and jarring in the silence. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. "Hello?" he whispered. A voice, raspy and low, replied, "You shouldn't have come." The line went dead. He dropped the phone and stumbled out of the room, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The chat was blowing up, but he didn't dare look at it. He needed to leave. Now. But when he turned to head back to the lobby, the hallway seemed different. Longer. The doors were spaced farther apart, the wallpaper darker, almost black. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space around him had grown cavernous. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, gripping his flashlight tightly. Then he heard it, a soft, wet sound like something being dragged. It came from behind him. Slowly he turned, the beam of his flashlight shaking. At first he saw nothing, but then, in the distance, something emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were impossibly thin and long, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was featureless except for a gaping mouth, its lips pulled back in a grotesque grin. It moved toward him in jerky, unnatural motions, its head lolling to one side. Dan ran. His camera bounced wildly as he sprinted down the endless hallway. He didn't stop, didn't look back. The dragging sound grew louder, faster, closer. He screamed as he burst through a door, only to find himself back in the lobby. The front door was gone. The lobby was no longer the one he'd entered. The chandelier was missing, replaced by a black void in the ceiling. The papers on the front desk were blank, their edges curling upward as if burned. And in the middle of the room stood a figure, its back to him. Who are you?" Dan stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure turned. It was him. His own face stared back at him, pale and lifeless, the eyes hollow and dark. It smiled, a cruel, knowing smile, before whispering, "Welcome home." Dan's scream cut through the darkness as the live stream abruptly ended. His channel was never updated again. Authorities found his abandoned car outside the hotel the next day, but there was no sign of him inside, or of the equipment he'd brought. The live stream, however, still exists. If you watch it closely, some say you can hear faint whispers in the background, growing louder toward the end. And if you pause at just the right moment, you might see the figure that followed him, standing just behind him, grinning in the shadows.
Story number 5.
No one had lived in the Green Hollow apartment complex for years. The building stood vacant, a hollow shell of peeling paint and broken windows, surrounded by stories of mysterious deaths and disappearances. Despite the warnings, Kayla took the job to catalog the complex for redevelopment. It was her first major assignment as an urban planner, and she couldn't pass it up, even if the place gave her chills. Her first day was uneventful. She spent hours taking measurements, snapping photos, and jotting notes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the building had become a maze of long, shadowed hallways. Kayla told herself she would finish up quickly and leave. But as she worked, she felt it, a distinct weight in the air, like the building itself was watching her. At dusk, she entered apartment 3C. The smell hit her first, a sour, metallic stench that made her gag. The unit was empty except for a single chair in the middle of the room. On the floor just beneath the chair was a faded stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Kayla took a photo, her hands shaking. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut. Her scream echoed in the stillness. She tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Her phone had no signal. She banged on the door, shouting for help, but the only answer was the eerie silence. Then came the sound, a soft shuffling like bare feet moving across the floor. Kayla froze. The sound grew louder, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. She swung her flashlight toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. The beam caught nothing but cracked walls and a sagging ceiling. "Hello," she called, her voice quivering. No response. The shuffling stopped. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then from behind her a faint whisper, "Leave." Kayla spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but it was empty. She tried the door again, yanking at it with all her strength. It refused to open. Panic set in as the air grew colder. Her breath fogged in the beam of her light. The shuffling started again, this time faster, more frantic. It was coming from all around her, like multiple people moving at once. Shadows darted at the edges of her vision. She turned and turned, the light catching glimpses of movement, but never anything clear. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured by shadows, but she could feel its gaze, piercing and unrelenting. The figure raised an arm and pointed at her. Kayla stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The whisper returned, louder now, overlapping voices that filled them. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." The light from her flashlight flickered, then died. The room plunged into total darkness. Kayla fumbled for her phone, using its weak glow to light her way. She backed toward the door, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, a cacophony of anger and sorrow. Something cold brushed against her arm, and she screamed. Suddenly, the door swung open. She bolted into the hallway, not daring to look back. She ran down the stairs, through the main lobby, and out into the night. She didn't stop until she reached her car, where she collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably. The next day, she returned with her supervisor and a team of workers to explain what had happened. But apartment 3C was pristine. No chair, no stain, and no signs of disturbance. The door opened easily, as though it had never been stuck. Kayla quit the project that afternoon. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had escaped something terrible, something hungry. Months later, she read a news article. Worker found dead in Green Hollow complex. The accompanying photo showed the blood-stained floor of apartment 3C. The chair had returned, and this time there was something sitting in it.
Story number 6.
Lila had always been a night owl. Her small studio apartment on the 5th floor of a downtown building was her haven, a perfect place to stay up late reading or working on her art. But recently, something had been disturbing her peace. It started as a faint tapping noise on her window. At first, she dismissed it as the wind or a bird, even though she lived too high up for such things. The tapping was irregular, soft at times, loud enough to make her jump at others. She told herself it was nothing and focused on her work. But one night, as she painted under the glow of her desk lamp, the tapping grew more deliberate. She turned to the window, expecting to see some branch brushing against the glass. Instead, there was nothing, just the city skyline, quiet and still. When she turned back to her painting, she nearly dropped her brush. Her canvas was ruined. Thick streaks of black paint ran across it, as if someone had dragged their fingers through her work. Her hands shook. She hadn't done that. She couldn't have. She decided to go to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come easily. She felt watched, as if a pair of unseen eyes were following her every move. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Why did you cover the window?" Her blood ran cold. She hadn't covered the window, but when she looked, the curtains were drawn shut, something she never did. Heart pounding, she reached out and pulled them open, half expecting to see someone on the fire escape. There was no one there. Over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated. Her lights flickered unpredictably, objects moved when she wasn't looking, and the tapping on the window became more insistent. One night, she finally decided to record it, setting up her phone to capture whatever was happening while she slept. When she woke the next morning, the phone was on the floor. The screen cracked. She picked it up and played the video, dreading what she might see. At first, the footage showed her sleeping, the room silent except for the occasional hum of passing traffic. But at 3:12 a.m., the tapping started. A shadow passed across the window, a tall, spindly figure that moved unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. It stopped at the glass, pressing a hand against it. The shape of its fingers was wrong, too long, too thin. And then, impossibly, it turned to look directly into the camera. The screen went black. Lila called the building's superintendent, desperate for answers. He was reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted that a tenant on her floor had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. People say he used to watch the other tenants through their windows, the superintendent said. Even after he was gone, some of them swore they still saw him. That night, Lila didn't sleep. She packed a bag, planning to leave the apartment for good. As she zipped up her suitcase, she heard the tapping again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Slowly, she turned toward her closet. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. Her chest tightened as she stepped closer, her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand. She reached out, grasping the doorknob, and yanked it open. The closet was empty. But as she turned back, her breath caught. In the reflection of the window, she saw it. The figure, standing directly behind her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes empty voids. The tapping sound began again, louder, more frantic, but this time it wasn't on the window. It was her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears as the light in her apartment flickered and went out. When the neighbors complained about the noise the next day, the superintendent went to check on her. The apartment was empty. Lila was gone. The only thing left was her phone, lying on the floor. It played the same recording over and over, a faint, distorted whisper. "Why did you cover the window?"
Story number 7.
The first thing Mia noticed when she moved into her new apartment was the smell. It was faint, barely there, like damp earth and old wood. The landlord had assured her it was just the age of the building. She was fine with that. Quirks like this came with affordable city living. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. Mia unpacked, decorated, and settled into her new routine. But then she started hearing it, a faint scratching noise in the walls coming from the corner of her bedroom. At first, she thought it might be rats, but the landlord swore the building had been treated for pests just weeks ago. Probably just the pipes, he said dismissively. But it wasn't the pipes. The scratching grew louder at night, as if something was desperately clawing to get out. Mia tried to ignore it, stuffing earplugs in and playing music to drown it out. But the noise wasn't the only thing. Things started moving. Her keys, her wallet, even her shoes, items she knew she'd left on the table or by the door, would end up in strange places. She found her toothbrush in the freezer one morning and her kitchen knives arranged in a neat row on the floor the next. Then came the smell. It grew stronger, no longer faint, but overwhelming, like rotting flesh and mildew. No matter how much she cleaned or sprayed air freshener, it lingered, seeping into her clothes and hair. She began to dread coming home, the weight of the apartment pressing down on her as soon as she stepped through the door. One night, she decided to investigate the wall where the scratching was loudest. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, she pried open a small hole in the drywall. As the debris fell away, she was hit by a wave of the foul odor. Coughing, she shone the light into the hole and screamed. A single, bloodshot eye stared back at her. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When she dared to look again, the hole was empty. Trembling, she called the landlord, who arrived half an hour later with tools to patch the wall. He laughed nervously when she told him what she'd seen, chalking it up to her imagination. "There's no way anyone could fit in these walls," he said. But he didn't meet her eyes. That night, Mia tried to sleep, but the scratching returned, louder and more erratic. It wasn't just coming from the corner anymore. It was all around her, from every wall. Then came the whispering. Faint at first, just a single voice speaking too softly to make out the words. Then more voices joined in, overlapping, growing louder. They weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were in her room. Mia froze, unable to move, her breath shallow and rapid. The voices stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt tangible. And then right by her ear, she heard a raspy whisper. "Let us in." She bolted upright, fumbling for the light switch, but the bulb exploded in a shower of sparks. In the darkness, she saw movement. A shadow in the corner, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs stretching and twisting like tree branches. It stepped toward her, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Mia ran. She didn't stop to grab anything, didn't care that she was barefoot and still in her pajamas. She fled down the hall, down the stairs, and out into the cold night air, her heart pounding. She never went back to the apartment. The next tenant lasted less than a month, and the one after that. Eventually, the building was condemned, left to rot like the presence inside it. But sometimes, passers-by swear they see movement in the windows, hear faint scratching sounds as they walk by, and catch a whiff of that sickly, rotting smell. No one stays long enough to find out why.
Story number 8.
The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery, but nothing was more infamous than the house on Sycamore Street. It was known simply as the Mirror House. For decades, it stood abandoned, its windows reflecting the trees outside in eerie clarity, even on the darkest nights. Local children dared each other to touch its cracked wooden door, but no one ever went inside. Until Kara did. Kara was new in town, a photographer looking for inspiration. The locals warned her about the house, their faces pale with unease when she asked for directions. "It watches," an old man muttered. "Don't go in." But Kara had a fascination with forgotten places, and the Mirror House was too tempting to resist. She arrived just before sunset, her camera slung over her shoulder. The house seemed to shimmer in the fading light, its cracked mirrors embedded in the exterior walls, catching the last rays of the sun. She snapped a few shots of the overgrown yard and creaking porch, feeling a strange pull toward the front door. When she stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, oppressive, and smelled faintly of decay. Every wall was lined with mirrors, some whole, others shattered into jagged pieces. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the house were larger on the inside than it appeared. Kara raised her camera and began to take pictures. The flash illuminated the mirrors, reflecting the light back in dazzling patterns. But as she reviewed the images on her camera screen, her heart skipped a beat. In each photo, there was a figure standing behind her, a pale, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes. She spun around, her breath hitching, but there was no one there. Just the mirrors, reflecting her own terrified face. Her skin prickled as she noticed something else. The reflections didn't match reality. In the mirrors, the hallway stretched endlessly, with doors that didn't exist in the physical space. Her curiosity outweighed her fear, and she stepped closer to one of the mirrored doors. Her own reflection stared back at her, but as she reached for the doorknob, the reflection didn't move. It stood still, watching her, its eyes darker than before. Kara yanked her hand away and turned to leave, but the hallway seemed to have changed. It was longer now. The mirrors lining the walls warped and cracked. The door she'd entered through was gone, replaced by a massive mirror that reflected her tiny, shaking form. A soft noise broke the silence, a faint, wet whisper coming from behind one of the mirrors. It grew louder, more insistent, as though someone or something was trying to break through. Her breathing quickened as hairline fractures began to spread across the glass. "Help me," a voice rasped, distorted and broken. She backed away, her camera clutched tightly in her hands, but the mirrors all around her began to ripple, as if something beneath the surface was trying to push through. Shadows moved within the glass, clawing at the edges, their shapes distorted and wrong. One of the mirrors shattered, and from it emerged a hand, thin, pale, and impossibly long. It grabbed the frame, pulling itself out. Kara screamed as the creature crawled through, its body bending in unnatural angles, its hollow eyes fixed on her. She ran, but every turn led her deeper into the house. The mirrors mocked her, showing reflections of her panicked face alongside twisted, shadowy figures that grew closer with each passing moment. The walls seemed to close in, the house folding itself around her. Finally, she stumbled into a room with no mirrors, just a single ornate frame hanging on the far wall. Relief flooded her for a moment, but when she looked closer, she realized the frame wasn't empty. It held her reflection. But her reflection didn't move. Kara's chest tightened as she saw herself in the frame, screaming silently, her fists pounding against the glass from the other side. She turned to run, but the room was gone, replaced by a vast, dark void. The last thing she saw was her reflection in the frame, smiling wickedly as it turned and walked away. Weeks later, a local child dared his friend to peek through the broken windows of the mirror house. They swore they saw someone inside, a woman standing motionless in the hallway, her face blank and her eyes hollow. The house still stands, its mirrors waiting. Some say it holds the souls of those it traps. Others say it's simply a house, albeit one with an uncanny way of catching the light. But no one dares to test its pull anymore. No one who knows what it can do.